In the not-so-distant future, a space capsule called Pilgrim is on its way to Mars, carrying soil samples. Scientists hope these samples will confirm the existence of alien life. But a mishap occurs when the Pilgrim is struck by asteroids, knocking it off course. Now, the crew aboard the International Space Station must step in to intercept Pilgrim and retrieve the precious samples. With teamwork, Rory gets ready for a spacewalk, while the rest of the crew rushes to assist. Outside the station, Rory carefully guides the mechanical arm to capture Pilgrim. When they make contact, the station shakes, causing a moment of worry, but Rory successfully secures the capsule. Back inside, astrobiologist Hugh examines the sample and makes an exciting discovery: a nearly fossilized single-cell organism. Attempts to revive it initially fail, but mimicking Earth's ancient atmosphere brings the organism to life. The crew rejoices at this groundbreaking find. News of the discovery spreads, and the crew shares their experiences on TV, even explaining astronaut life basics like using the bathroom. Children around the world are thrilled to participate in naming the organism, settling on the name Calvin. Meanwhile, Dr. Miranda monitors David's health concerns. Despite nearing a new record for days spent in space and facing physical challenges, David prefers the tranquility of space to the chaos of Earth. As days pass, Hugh observes Calvin's rapid growth, marveling at its unique cellular structure. Commander Kat describes Calvin as a creature with a brain, muscles, and eyes all in one. Hugh notices that Calvin is growing new parts, so he tries touching it. When he does, Calvin's cells move and make interesting shapes. During dinner, engineer Sho gets to see his wife give birth through a video call. He meets his newborn daughter, and the crew congratulates him. Kat gives him a book for reading stories during video calls. After dinner, David checks his body for problems using special software, while Hugh checks on Calvin. Calvin, though small, now has a proper body and climbs Hugh's finger. A few weeks later, an alarm from the lab startles the crew. Rory fixes the problem quickly, but Miranda wonders how it happened. Hugh blames himself, thinking he missed something. Rory and Miranda scold him, reminding him to be careful. After a few more days, Calvin becomes completely still. The crew thinks it might be hibernating due to the change in air pressure caused by the alarm. Miranda is glad to see Calvin inactive because it had been growing too fast. While Calvin rests, the crew reinforces lab security to keep it sealed off. Later, while Miranda checks on Hugh's legs, he confesses feeling guilty about his mistake possibly causing Calvin's condition. After discussing options, Hugh tries stimulating Calvin with a low voltage of electricity to wake it up. The first attempts fail, but suddenly Calvin grabs Hugh's hand, breaking the electric wand. Hugh tries to free his hand, but Calvin's strength surprises everyone. Calvin squeezes Hugh's hand so hard that it distorts. The crew wants to help, but Miranda refuses, fearing for their safety. As Hugh struggles, his head hits the box, causing him to pass out. Calvin finally releases his hand, revealing its mess. Calvin tests the glove's strength and finds a way to break free using the electric wand. Calvin immediately attacks the lab rat, devouring it quickly. While Calvin is occupied, Rory enters the lab to rescue Hugh. However, Calvin jumps onto Rory's leg, forcing the crew to seal the lab with Rory inside. Rory tries to burn Calvin with an oxygen candle, but Calvin dodges and hides. Kat gives Rory permission to kill Calvin, so Rory chases it with an incinerator, but Calvin remains unharmed. Running out of fuel, Rory opens the container where Calvin hid, but it's empty. Suddenly, Calvin jumps on Rory's face and enters his mouth. The crew watches in horror as Rory is slowly killed from the inside, leaving only a floating body surrounded by blood. The incinerator floats away and triggers the fire alarm, filling the lab with suppressant gas. Calvin emerges from Rory, now 10 times larger. The crew scrambles to close gas valves, but Calvin squeezes through a hole to escape the lab. They wrap up Rory's body, and Kat sends a distress call to NASA, but Sho discovers that communications are down. The transmitter is failing, so they need to fix it outside to contact Earth. Kat suits up for a spacewalk and finds the overheated transmitter with an empty coolant chamber. Calvin must have eaten it. Suddenly, Calvin attaches itself to Kat, trying to breach her suit. Despite its size, the suit holds, but Kat's coolant tube is damaged, filling her helmet with liquid. Struggling to see, Kat jumps to reach the airlock faster, risking hitting the station. David suits up to help, but Kat is already drowning as water fills her helmet. Wanting to bring Calvin down, Kat grabs the airlock lever, preventing David from opening it. Sadly, Kat drowns in a few seconds, and the crew watches as her body floats away. Calvin, however, jumps onto the station before her body drifts too far. The crew mourns their commander, but Hugh reminds them they need to keep Calvin out of the ship. Despite being unaffected by the vacuum, they realize Calvin can enter through the thrusters. Sho turns on thrusters whenever Calvin approaches, but it causes the station to shake and lose its course. With no other choice, Sho uses the remaining fuel to correct the station's orbit, allowing Calvin to sneak inside again. Hugh theorizes that Calvin's species once dominated Mars, but went into hibernation when the atmosphere collapsed. They decide to simulate the atmosphere's absence to force Calvin into inactivity. The crew seals themselves in a capsule, expelling oxygen from the station. Hugh feels unwell and sees something in the shadows, but dismisses it. As they wait, they reinforce the seals and prepare for the next steps. The crew mourns their lost friends, with Hugh blaming himself for the tragedy. David reminds him it was a team decision to confront Calvin. Hugh acknowledges that Calvin is simply trying to survive by feeding. Suddenly, Hugh passes out, and the crew rushes to stabilize him as his vitals drop. While using the defibrillator, they notice movement on Hugh's leg. Opening his suit, they find Calvin feeding on him unnoticed due to Hugh's condition. Miranda tries shocking Calvin with the defibrillator, but it only makes the creature float and reveal its evolved body. Panicked, the crew rushes out, accidentally splitting up. Sho hides inside a sleeping pod as Calvin tries to break it. Eventually, Calvin loses interest and leaves. David and Miranda return to Hugh, who is nearing the end of his life. Hugh asks to be lifted so he can experience floating one last time before he passes away. As they mourn his death, they notice a beeping light on the screen. It's Hugh's tracker, accidentally swallowed by Calvin. Now they can track Calvin's movements and come up with a plan. Calvin roams around the station and eventually returns to Hugh's body. As it begins feeding, it realizes it's trapped just before David and Miranda seal the door. They purge the oxygen from the room to suffocate Calvin, which will take some time. Suddenly, the computer announces an approaching shuttle. David realizes that Kat's message reached Earth. However, the shuttle isn't there to rescue them. It's the last emergency firewall. Miranda explains that it's meant to push them into deep space to prevent Calvin from reaching Earth. In the sleeping chamber, Sho hears the announcement and believes they're being rescued. He leaves the pod hatch open as he heads towards the shuttle, unaware of the danger. Miranda and David rush to warn Sho, but it's too late. Calvin sneaks behind him as he opens the hatch. With the shuttle departing, the open hatch causes decompression, sucking Sho into space while Calvin climbs his leg. Miranda tries to pull Sho back, but Calvin climbs higher, forcing Sho to let go of her hand. Sho gets sucked into space, but Calvin manages to cling to the station again. It tries to grab Miranda next, but she shocks it with a tool, pushing it away. She joins David to make their way back inside, closing the door behind them. Looking out the window, they see the station falling apart, crashing into itself. David checks the computer and finds they're losing life support, with temperature and oxygen dropping rapidly. The chaos has pushed the station towards Earth, giving them about 30 minutes before re-entry. Unfortunately, they can't survive re-entry, and they can't reach the escape pods with Calvin attacking them. Their situation seems dire as they face the impending crash. As David and Miranda face their fate and endure the cold, they find the book they bought for Sho's daughter. David decides to read it, finding solace in the words. When he says, "Goodbye, air," an idea strikes him. They can lure Calvin into an escape pod using oxygen candles. David proposes sacrificing himself by launching with Calvin into deep space, giving Miranda the chance to reach another pod and land safely on Earth. Miranda hesitates at the thought of David sacrificing himself, but he reassures her, reminding her of his piloting skills and his preference for space over Earth. They both suit up, and David heads out into the corridors, dropping oxygen candles along the way to lure Calvin to the escape pod. Calvin soon appears, jumping from candle to candle as he follows David. David quickly reaches the pod and gets inside, with Calvin clinging to him tightly. David distracts Calvin with another candle and manages to close the pod hatch, trapping Calvin inside. Miranda notices David's plan and rushes to reach the other pod. As the capsules disconnect from the station and fly away, debris hits them, causing malfunctions. Miranda struggles with her controls, while David tries to maintain his pod's trajectory. However, Calvin grabs both of David's hands, causing him to scream in pain. Despite the shaky flying, one pod manages to fly off into deep space, while the other lands in the middle of the ocean. Fishing boats surround it to offer help, but upon opening the pod, it's revealed that David has made it safely to Earth, while Miranda is lost in space. This means Calvin now has an entire planet to terrorize. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like our channel and subscribe if you enjoy content like this. Also, let us know what movie you would love us to recap for you.